Okay, welcome everybody to Brit and Rupert's History of Gaming. Last time we got up to the early 90s, Sony, Nintendo,
Nirvana.
not Sony, Nintendo, Sega Nintendo, what am I on
Yeah.
about? Nirvana, yes. And now we're moving into the mid-90s to Sony, yeah.
Yeah.
Sony PlayStation, 1995.
It was a good time.
It was yeah, it was an interesting time. As we mentioned last time, I mean, the actual PlayStation was originally going to be a CD-based console or CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, and yeah, in 1995 they released the Sony PlayStation, and it kind of changed everything with regard to gaming. How would you remember it?
I remember my friend's brother had one, and I remember going over there, and he was playing. It was a sports game, and I remember thinking at the time that the two main things I noticed with the graphics were they dated. Now they've dated pretty badly compared to like the Super Nintendo, and that
Yes,
basically because they're polygons and not sprites.
yes.
But I also remember the sound and hearing like full, like not only digitized speech, but in the sports games, full commentation and
The
stuff.
CD quality,
Yeah, and actual like,
digitized speech.
yeah,
Yeah.
and like wave file quality soundtracks and stuff. And I also remember the load times as well, because of course it
Ah,
was a
yeah.
constant reading from a CD. It
Yeah,
was
that was
a
a
no
that was a
hard drive.
thing. That was a thing actually, because of course cartridges, as we explained last time, they're instant because
Mm.
there's no transfer required. But with CDs, you did have load screens. But yeah, like you say, it's like suddenly you had CD quality music. Uh, you know, the speech was just recorded speech, and you had cutscenes which looked, well, I'm not going to say real, but they were pretty cool for the time.
I think it's worth pointing out as well the difference in the how much data a CD can hold compared to a
Oh yeah,
cartridge.
yeah. It's massive.
Because isn't it like at the time, I guess without compression software, it would have been is it 650 megabytes for just a
Hmm.
standard CD, and I think a with compression on the Mega Drive, it was a 2 or 4 megabyte cartridge.
Yeah. So that was awkward. And of course the floppy disk, what, 1, 2 megabytes tops?
Yeah, well, yeah,
Um,
1.44.
Awkward time. So it's naturally going to go to CD. So that's what happened. But also what Sony did, which was clever, and to get a new demographic, was to make actually what they really did was make gaming cool. Because if you remember the adverts at the time, some really bizarre.
I can't
So
remember any.
there was there was a famous one with like an alien woman. It was like she was sitting in this. I mean, you can see it online, but she was sitting in this room, and it was quite strange, like CCTV camera footage. And she was just a slightly strange looking like alien lady with these huge eyes, and she was just talking nonsense basically. But it was so weird, and it didn't really have anything directly to do with gaming. It was just a kind of like it was a cool thing to be associated with. So basically, Sony had managed to tap into a demographic which was no longer just geeky
Mm.
boys, basically. It was actually cool to like older people.
I d
People perhaps who'd grown up with games but were now young adult at the time when normally you'd be moving out of gaming. It was like they were
an excuse to get
continuing
back
in
into it.
gaming.
I don't remember. I usually with these sorts of things, it's not a piece of hardware that sort of captures the public consciousness. It's usually like a killer app sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I can't put my finger on a specific game that like blew the market wide open to every demographic like it did.
No,
It
I
just seemed to sort of happen.
Yeah, I think it was almost a reversal of the, we were talking about the seal of quality on the NES, which changed the industry in the mid 80s. So it was like quality over quantity, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Now what Sony had done was they basically opened it up to everyone. So
Yeah.
the amount of games on the PlayStation, the original PlayStation, was astonishing,
It's
and it meant there was something for everyone.
yeah.
It was rubbish.
Oh,
Most of what was released on the PlayStation was
when
rubbish.
you pick them up now, and the difference, especially because it's dated as it has,
Yeah.
because it was like the birth of sort of decent 3D. Um, like you play racing games now. I played a game called Roll Cage the other day, and you can't. The pop up is so bad, and that you can't
Mm.
see the track.
Yeah.
It's just constant. But at the time, I thought it was great and really
Yeah.
fast, but it's so choppy.
Pop up is when it's in a polygon game where it's like the action is happening, and because it can only show, because the hardware can only show a certain number of polygons on the screen at once, things,
Will
objects,
just
polygon
appear.
objects will just suddenly appear in front of you
Yeah.
because it can't create all the objects using the hardware. So I suppose in terms of key games on the PlayStation and tying into that kind of cool factor, I guess Wipeout was quite
Oh
an
God, yeah,
important.
Wipeout was a futuristic racing game where your ships are mostly essentially shaped like darts or arrows, and
Mm,
it's just a techno soundtrack, and you race along. It's almost like a sort of a half pipe sort of shape,
mm,
and you're sort of magnetized to the track. I think
yeah,
it's supposed to be when you pick up power ups.
really cool looking. It was. I
Yeah.
mean, the Designers
I
Republic
can
did the
imagine they sort
design
of
for that.
marketed it. I don't know this for certain, but I can imagine they marketed it as like sort of like a cool Mario Kart for adults.
Yeah, and also it put PlayStations in actual clubs, in actual dance clubs,
Really?
so you could play, like in the chill out rooms, you could play Wipeout.
That's cool.
So it really brought it into the hands of like a young adult, like cool, like community. It wasn't just like geeks at home sort of thing.
Mm.
So that was stylish, very cool.
The other one, which at the time, sorry to interrupt,
No, go
that
on.
I didn't realize was such a big deal, but when you read about it now, you realize the impact it actually had.
Mm.
Oddly, was Crash Bandicoot.
Yeah,
Yeah, it was so like I mean, you look at it, and it's so it's sort of a 3D sort of
mm.
linear, like sort of it's basically like Mario but viewed from a different angle,
Yeah.
essentially.
Isn't it you're going into the screen?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you've got there are some levels, Rupert, where you're being chased by a boulder and you're running at the screen, and of course you cannot see what's in front of you, and that is
That
trial and error
sounds
gameplay, Rupert.
sounds ill-conceived, if you like. Yeah, that was a big deal actually because they had a lot of spin-offs as well. So you had like Crash Bandicoot Racing and stuff like that.
And through the generations, I think they still
Yeah.
made them up through the PS2 era.
So, and also, I suppose the other one would be Tomb Raider,
Mm,
which was such a massive game at the time.
yeah,
Uh, Basic now in terms of graphically,
yeah.
but yeah, still just about playable, and it looked amazing for the time. And also, it had a female heroine, and also a kind of cinematic style to it, a cinematic adventure
Yeah,
style.
I remember the music being quite sweeping.
Yeah,
And also what I really loved about it, silly thing, but of course you had dual handguns with infinite ammo, which I thought was so cool at the time.
it was so. How do you describe it? Sort of a 3D adventure, puzzle adventure, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was one of those games where I mean, partly down to the bad graphics, or the dated graphics, of
Yeah.
course, because it was such harsh polygons, was the fact that you were in situations you basically had to find your way through.
Mm.
So I think at the start of the game you start off in sort of near a waterfall in sort of a cave, and you have
Mm.
to find your way out of the cave, and it's just timed jumps and rolls.
Yeah.
But it was a really good game.
Yeah, and of course, so she kind of became the face of PlayStation, I suppose, because I mean,
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
she kind of became the mascot, in a way that Mario was a mascot of Nintendo, I guess, and then Sonic was the mascot of Sega.
it's quite cool that it was a female protagonist.
Yeah, I mean, she was quite kind of sexualized back then.
Oh, come
Not
on.
so much in the game actually, because the graphics were so limited,
Yeah,
but it was mostly in the kind of
advertising and the
advertising and stuff
booklet.
like that. They
Yeah,
just get some big boobed like
yeah.
model. It's changed a bit now since it's been rebooted. It's much. I mean, now the reboot in the 2013 that was written by a woman, and it was much more feminist perspective. So
Is she at all sexualized in the game? Like even like with the
mm,
graphics, with the boobs and.
not really. I
Oh,
mean,
okay.
she's no, and it's never really mentioned. That's the thing. It's not a factor.
That's the key to the door.
So there's not men leering over and stuff, and she's not really scantily clad as such. But the fact that it's written by a woman makes a big difference, I think. Speaking of Tomb Raider, I mean, it was that was rendered in 3 dimensions. Just to recap, difference between pixels and polygons. Pixels are 2D shapes, like pictures on a page, animated, whereas polygons are flat planes
Yeah,
joined together to create a 3D model. However, as Britt alluded to, the hardware wasn't quite up to scratch.
it was astonishing at the time, and I don't remember playing games at the time and thinking, "Oh, this is awkward. This
Yeah,
is early. This is
like
this is a form of hardware in its infancy." I just
yeah,
remember being blown away by it. But
yeah,
out of a lot of the consoles that you play from that era, that from well throughout the years, that one seems to have dated
yes.
quite badly.
Because I mean, with sprites, it'll always look. You can have beautiful sprites and they'll always look beautiful.
Mm.
With polygons, basically, the more powerful the hardware, the more polygons you can show on the screen. That's the simple rule.
Mm.
And unfortunately, the PlayStation was it was powerful for the time, but now compared to now, it means that you can really not render that many polygons on the screen. So it looks very blocky and it's
Yeah.
difficult to really make out what's happening. But yeah, it was the PlayStation was proof that CD consoles could work, and we've mentioned the fact that CDs can hold a lot more data, which meant full voice acting, more elaborate cutscenes. So I suppose it was really the beginning of Hollywood style productions, I guess. Whereas games before would have been produced by very small teams, now they were getting bigger, a lot more expansive, should
Mm.
we say? And I mean, it meant that the genres expanded as well. I'm going to mention Resident Evil.
Yeah.
Can you describe Resident Evil, please?
Resident Evil was it's essentially a haunted house game where
Hmm.
you're a team called the STARS team, and you'll get dropped into I think one of your previous teams goes missing, so you get dropped into this sort of mansion where it turns out they're doing all sorts of naughty experiments. But it's sort of photograph quality, but it was a sort of static background, and then you as a character, and it was a static camera as well.
Yeah,
So each sort of, which made it more cinematic. Every room you
yeah,
went in, there would be a sort of set camera angle looking at that view. So, and then you would control the character from that angle.
yeah. And that was survival horror,
Yeah,
which is essentially you've got it's a horror game where there are enemies or some threat, but you've got limited means to actually kill them, or perhaps no means to kill them. So really, it's just about surviving, getting out of there, hiding, whatever,
and solving puzzles.
and solving puzzles. Some of the puzzles in Resident Evil, oh,
Yeah, so that you would go up to a door and it would say the door is locked. There is an eagle shaped emblem hole, and then you'd wander down the road and kill a zombie, and then you dropped an eagle shaped emblem, and then you'd spend hours tapping your chin thinking, oh. But of course, the best part of Resident Evil was when you were sort of outside, and there was a waist high locked gate and a small sort of picket fence about ankle high, and there was no way to traverse it, and you'd have to go 4 hours out of your way to find a key to open the gate, and you
yeah.
could just kick through.
Yeah, it was, but it was very atmospheric,
Yes.
and I mean, it really helped. The sound really helped in that because, of course, CD quality sound, so you had like proper music. Voice acting wasn't the best,
Oh,
but
you please look up the voice acting of Resident Evil online,
it's
please.
astonishing.
Yeah.
Um,
And of course, jump scares. There were a few jump scares in it, which were quite cool.
yeah, it was very cinematic in its use of angles and stuff. I'm just gonna, as a digression here, I'm gonna mention the fact that the story of Resident Evil and its sequels is almost the story of where modern gaming went. It went from it was
South?
it was innovative, it was subtle, and it basically in progressive sequels got more and more action based, and
And
it
away
didn't,
from its roots.
yeah, and much more away from the whole idea of survival horror, and it just turned into
An action
shooting,
game.
yeah, shooting things with pretty much infinite ammo. So that's where that went. But the original, the first few, are really quite atmospheric.
The first two at a push three.
Yeah. So PlayStation didn't really have much of a rival at the time, and that really helped Sony to cement their place. I mean, Nintendo.
Sorry, before you go, we
Yeah.
should probably mention the other consoles at the time that kind of came and went. I mean,
Hmm.
we mentioned the Philips CDI last time.
Yeah.
But I suppose the main competitor they
Yeah.
had was the Sega Saturn,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
which was a great little console and had loads of exclusives and had some really nice games for it. But it just couldn't. It couldn't
Yeah.
keep up.
It was another CD-based console, but it just got completely wiped out by PlayStation. It just wasn't the cool option people wanted.
Yeah. I
PlayStation.
don't know what the power differences were and the graphical differences.
Yeah.
They seemed similar.
Yeah, I don't think it was negligible. So yeah, that didn't go so well. And I mean, Nintendo had the Nintendo 64, which so obviously they pulled out of the PlayStation deal and gone their own way because they believed in cartridges still, and it proved to be a bad decision.
Speaking about consoles dating badly, the N64 is easily the console that I own is the most dated.
Yeah.
It's quite sad. It's such foggy, washed out graphics, and it's an unusual control scheme. But I've read recently that if you look, you could put up a picture of the Nintendo 64 pad, which you kind of held almost in a sort of gun grip,
Yes,
which instantly meant that half the pad was unavailable to you.
it's bizarre.
And I remember recently, or a few years ago, it got voted the best controller, but it's just pure nostalgia because the control scheme is really shoehorned into the game that you use it for, and it's just awkward.
It is, and I mean, it did innovate, of course, because Nintendo always innovate with their machines. So it had 4 ports on the front, for instance,
Which is awesome. Yeah.
which was a great idea. So you could have 4-player games, and then it would also, I think they introduced a Rumble Pack at that point.
If you think about it, I suppose, because the N64 came out in, I think, 96 in
96,
Japan and
yeah,
97
yeah,
here,
yeah.
or something like that. And the PlayStation came out, I think, 94 in Japan, 95 over
Yeah.
here. So they sort of took it with the four ports on the front. They turned it into a sort of party home console,
Yes. Yeah.
and focused on that aspect of things,
Yeah.
which was
So
which was a good
rather
move.
than like
Rather
rather
than
than
trying to out
keeping away from the
hardware
whole
them, yeah.
multimedia route
Mm,
of like, oh yeah, look at this, you can play CDs, and all this, and it's like for the people, it's like this is for the gamers sort of thing.
yeah.
But not that many gamers obviously wanted it. It did actually sell pretty well. I think it sold about 40 million or something, which is actually the same as a Mega Drive. The problem is the PlayStation sold twice that probably.
Yeah.
Um,
They were everywhere.
yeah,
PlayStation
PlayStation
was
was
absolutely
massive.
everywhere.
Yeah, so yeah, but the N64 did innovate. So you had the four ports on the front. You had the Rumble Pack, which meant that the game, you could plug something into the controller and make it vibrate during certain games, like feedback, and also the analog stick, which is standard now. I mean, that first came then, and in fact, PlayStation released their own updated controller called the DualShock
With two analog
with
sticks
two analog sticks
and
in it,
Rumble Pack built in.
and that lasted for the next 10 odd years.
I
So.
think actually the Sega Saturn, when there was a game on the Sega Saturn called Nights into Dreams, and it utilized, you could use it on a normal pad, but they
Yeah.
released it was like a disc-shaped pad, and it had
Ah.
that. I think that was the first analog
Oh,
stick.
really?
They obviously had analog sticks in the 80s for the really early consoles, but
Yeah.
on that era of consoles.
We'll mention as well now, as you mentioned, Sega Saturn, the fall of Sega. I mean, I'm going to list their failed consoles
Okay.
and the reason why Sega were well fell apart really after the Sega Mega Drive. They released a series of failed consoles. Basically, there was the Sega Nomad, which I think did we mention that last time?
Yeah, the
The
handheld Mega
handheld
Drive.
Mega Drive. They released a Mega CD, which was the CD add-on.
Yeah.
They released a 32X, which was basically a way of trying to keep up with Sony PlayStation.
Yeah.
32 referring to
I've got to say
32-bit.
as well, it's something that's been said before, and I'm kind of paraphrasing someone here, but with all those add-ons you said, then the Mega CD, Sega CD, and the 32X, they were all add-ons for the Mega Drive to extend it, and it generally looked like it was on a life support machine because they all had separate. If you had them all plugged in at once, you'd
Yeah.
have three separate power plugs, which of course wouldn't fit into a normal,
No.
because they're such big bulky things, and they were generally just stretching it as much as they could to keep it going, and
Yeah.
they should have just focused on a new console.
Yeah, and then they did with the Saturn, but that failed. And then they went for something in the late 90s called the Dreamcast, which is regarded as a kind of a classic console.
It was
Um,
originally going to be called the Sega Katana, which I thought was a cooler name.
that is a cool name.
But of course, they called it the Dreamcast.
Yeah, so the Dreamcast, I mean, that introduced like that had an internet connection for goodness sake, and it wasn't even that was like 20th century, and they were introducing internet, and it had a little funky little screen on the controller.
Yeah, you could
Um,
plug the screen on that wasn't actually in the controller. It was on a thing called a video memory unit, a
mm,
VMU, and you could, if the batteries worked in them, you could plug them together, and they would
mm,
have little mini games on them.
hmm,
From the save games, it would also save a mini game, and you could sort of plug them into each other and sort of battle each other and unlock secrets in the games. It was all very gimmicky and all very innovative and very cool,
mm,
and stuff that obviously with the 3DS and stuff Nintendo sort of ran with, but it was the games on it were very much geared towards all the best games released in Japan. It was very
mm.
geared towards sort of things like bullet hell shooters, which I'll let you describe.
A bullet hell shooter is like a shoot 'em up, like like we mentioned, Space Invaders, say.
Mm.
But imagine Space Invaders and there's bullets flying everywhere. They call it bullet hell because it's like a hellfire of bullets
Yeah.
coming at you. In fact,
And games like Seaman, all
yeah,
these very odd games, and of course they're quite rare and really revered now, and Crazy Taxi and things like that.
mm,
But it just didn't. Well, basically, it couldn't keep up with the PS2.
no, which we'll get onto. So, Dreamcast was the final kind of failure, if you like, and people regard it very well now.
Mm-hmm.
And indeed,
Dreadful controller,
oh,
absolutely
it was
dreadful.
so bad.
It
It
was
had
so cheap sound feeling as well.
two kind of almost blade-like sections on the side, so it just hurt to hold anyway. And then you had the wire, instead of coming out the top and like away from you, of course the wire came out the bottom, like towards down into your crotch, and it's like, what is?
So it's constantly twisted,
Yeah,
and they fail a lot. The controllers, I've gone
right.
through a few, and I don't play it that much. Yeah, and it just feels cheap. The buttons are slightly wobbly. It's just cheap feeling.
Speaking of controllers, so you know, back in the 70s and 80s, we were talking about dials, and then it went to like two buttons, and then we had shoulder buttons introduced. Now we were seeing like dual sticks and vibrations introduced, and that kind of standardized controller. You still have that today, really.
If you think about it, the controllers haven't changed from the re-release of the PlayStation 1 pad through to the PS4, apart from
No,
sort of cosmetically.
no. Apart from those which have been innovating, but we'll get onto those in a bit. So yeah, as you mentioned, the PS2, which is simply the PlayStation 2. So this was like a more powerful PlayStation. Instead of a CD drive, it now had a DVD drive.
I think what happened with that, especially with the Dreamcast, which was a kind of main competitor at the time, the reason it smashed the Dreamcast was because you could play DVDs on it.
Yeah,
So if you imagine a student going to university
yeah,
and they can either buy like a Dreamcast and a DVD player, or
mm,
they can just buy it all in one. And it
yeah,
began to turn into a multimedia center, which the
absolutely, yeah.
Dreamcast couldn't do.
And it was affordable. It was an affordable DVD player, which is why it was the best-selling console of all time.
The PlayStation 2.
PlayStation 2, 155 million units sold around the world, 1.5 billion game sales. You can see I've done my homework on this bit. Um,
That means that some poor buggers have played Operation Winback apart from me.
oh, we can have a picture of Operation Windbag on there.
We need a sequel.
So the PlayStation 2, well, put it this way, right? This is a stat for you. It was released in March 2000. It was discontinued, officially discontinued, in January 2013. It was around for 13 years.
That's got to be the
Like,
longest lifespan of any console.
it was discontinued the same year that the PlayStation 4 came out.
Is it one of those things in a certain part of the world, or was it worldwide
No,
distribution?
it was still going. I mean, I remember PlayStation 2 games still being sold in game 2 or 3 years ago, like new, and they were still making new games to them up to 2013, like Pro Evolution Soccer and I think FIFA. Their 2014 edition came out on PS2, for instance. Yeah, PS2 was massive, but again, you had other consoles around at the time which weren't doing very well. Nintendo released their GameCube, which is
Hmm.
even less successful than Nintendo 64, but again, well, actually, unlike the N64, it was a great console.
Yeah, it still stands up today. In fact, we're going to play it tonight.
We are, aren't we?
Obviously, hot
Again,
like Desert Storm.
that continued the four controller ports. So it was a real gamers machine, and it uses tiny little cute discs, and still the games are still playable, still
Yeah.
look good.
And again, Nintendo tend to have the most exclusives, and the games are of the highest quality. So it's probably got quite a small library of like a few
Yeah,
hundred games against the PlayStation 2, which is probably worse than the PlayStation 1 for quality control. 70%, 80% of the games you pick up for the GameCube will be playable and really
mm,
good and still hold up today, whereas it'll be like 30% of the entire games library for the PlayStation will
yeah.
be the opposite.
So this was the sixth generation of consoles, which was when Microsoft released their Xbox as well, which was another competitor, which did okay for a first console.
I
It turned
genuinely thought that I thought it might have outsold the PlayStation 2. I didn't realize the
No,
stats
no, it
because
was it was quite low. It was
oh,
quite
right.
low.
They did seem to be everywhere. Maybe it's just a British thing.
The issue was that I think with Xbox you could get DVDs to play on it. I think it needed some kind
It
of extra
needed it
software as
needed
well.
a download or a
Yeah,
disc
or a
of some
disc.
sort. I vaguely remember that.
I think that one of the problems with the competitors was they didn't have the games, as in I'm thinking GTA 3,
Yeah.
as in Grand Theft Auto 3.
I'm thinking about the loading times on Morrowind on the Xbox.
Thinking fondly.
If you clicked on a door by accident, you can make a cup of tea.
Yeah, that was the problem with disc games. But I mean, the thing is, PlayStation 2 had such dominance at that time. It
Yeah.
was ridiculous. And I use Grand Theft Auto as an example because it couldn't be released on something like the Nintendo GameCube. The Nintendo GameCube discs just couldn't hold that
That much
enough
data.
data. Yeah, and that made such a difference because basically you were getting this was really when the real blockbuster games were coming out and when having an exclusive like Grand Theft Auto, which
Thinking about it, even the first Grand Theft Auto was released as an exclusive on the PlayStation, wasn't
console wise, yeah.
it? Yeah.
I think it was on PC as well, but in terms of Xbox, I mean, you did have something like Halo, which was where that originally came about. You might have
Hmm.
heard of that. That brought a new kind of generation in a way of
The
of of gamers.
it was sort of like a Halo was sort of a sci-fi first-person shooter slash sort of space opera,
Mm,
and it was a really good story.
mm.
But of course, what they do is they have a really beautiful story, and then it sells really well. And they turn it into a franchise, and they tack stuff on.
Yes. But Halo, I think, was probably responsible for the fact that Xbox could then get
A
a
foothold.
sequel. Yeah.
Yeah.
This was the sixth generation, basically, and I thought at this point to kind of just bring it to the end of this episode, we could talk a little bit about the generations and just explain that sixth generation doesn't really mean a lot. It's kind of easier in a way to explain things in terms of a bit more broadly. So you've got, say, the 8-bit generation, which is
Mm.
quite distinctive to look at, right?
Yeah.
And that was followed by the 16-bit generation, which again is distinctive. You'd know the graphics, and we could have
Yeah, you could
pictures of
tell where. Yeah.
what they look like. And then you had the 32-bit generation, which was like PlayStation.
That's where it gets a bit vague.
And
Yeah.
this is where it starts to get a bit vague because basically after that, it really wasn't that easy to determine. And essentially, once the PlayStation 1 came along and set the tone with kind of 3D worlds, basically all that would change in generations after that was the graphics would get better. And it was kind of almost like games were becoming standardized in terms of their style. I mean, if you're going to choose your favorite generation, what would it be?
Haunted by nostalgia. I remember being at my happiest with when I had an Amiga 1200 and a Mega Drive.
16-bit
Yeah, yeah.
generation, so early 90s.
I was really content with that. I mean, what I found was when I got a game for the Mega Drive or a game for the Amiga, they would be good. And in the main, they would be good. You could read up, a magazine like
Mm.
CVG, Computer Video Game Magazine, and they would give them a good review, and they would be good.
Yeah.
But I think when I got a PlayStation, it became much more hit and miss.
Yes.
And of course, it got to the point where at that time I was sort of a teenager, and I was getting to the point where I would have to pay for my own sort of things,
Yes.
and I couldn't afford to splash out 40 quid in a game. It would just be total nonsense.
Yeah. Looking at the different generations, I suppose you've got the 8-bit generation, which is very, it's nostalgic time, but a lot of them aren't that playable anymore, to be honest.
No, and they're very, very similar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
16-bit was very distinctive. It had a tendency to be a bit trashy at times, perhaps, because essentially it really was just targeting a young male
Mm.
audience. It was quite an,
Skitchin on the Mega Drive, for example.
and it always, oh God, the games like that would be, I love how dated in style they are, like the kind of, it would have like kind of
Like looped
pseudo
hip-hop.
rock music or
Yeah.
yeah, or hip hop from the time it's like without real instruments and it's just like
Yeah, MIDI sort of
yeah.
sound and
I mean, PlayStation was a big leap, but I I felt that the 3D was too soon. It felt like they were
yeah.
innovating, trying new things, but it wasn't ready for that. Which brings
Most of my favorite thinking about it, most of my favorite games on the PlayStation were 2D, like
yes.
Alundra, Heart of Darkness.
So I mean, we can put some pictures of that on there because it has got some great 2D games. Rayman, that was original.
Mm.
I think that might have been even been a launch title. That was a 2D platformer. But then a PS2 era, PlayStation 2 era, GameCube era, I think that was a pretty classy time, really, because they could use 3D in a better
Yeah.
way. And there's some really good games which weren't trying to mimic movies too much yet. So they were proper games,
Yeah.
but in 3D, still playable. And it was quite, I think that was a good, it was quite a good era for
Yeah.
consoles.
Look, I
But
remember classic games that Rumble Racing is one of my favorite. I play that still now. Rumble Racing on the PS2 again because it was really beautiful, really smooth, but yet really tasty graphics. And
mm,
there was no pop up. There was no. And said on the Xbox in the same year, more when the loading times were an issue and the graphics weren't great, but it felt like a world you were being
mm,
taken into. And of course, the graphics, okay, they weren't amazing at the time, but they weren't. It didn't feel like it was struggling, which is
yeah,
the difference. Is when you're
yeah,
playing a game and it feels like it's struggling,
yes,
as opposed to just being what it is.
yeah. You think this is impressive, but it's too much
Yeah,
for what the
I
hardware
should
can
be playing
handle.
this in 2 years' time.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah, so just to bring it to the end of this episode, the idea of a game mimicking movies, the kind of cinematic experience of games, was just on the horizon really in the seventh generation of consoles, which we'll come to in our final episode. So thanks everyone.
bye bye.
Bye for now.